A thought forms in the brain, and somehow there is something it feels like to have that thought. Neurons fire, chemicals cross synapses, electrical rhythms spread through living tissue, yet none of those measurements fully explain why experience exists at all. Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff proposed a far stranger possibility that consciousness may reach below neurons, into quantum processes inside microscopic structures called microtubules, where fragile states could collapse into individual moments of awareness. The idea is known as Orch OR, and it remains deeply controversial. If calm journeys into difficult science are worth keeping around, a like subscription or share helps boring space sleepy continue making them. And thank you for choosing to spend part of your time here. Leave a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there, whether this is a late night wind down, a quiet study session, or simply a curious pause in the day. From here, the story moves beneath the neuron, toward the uncertain boundary where quantum physics and consciousness may or may not meet. Consciousness begins as an ordinary fact and becomes difficult only when science tries to explain it. A human brain contains networks of neurons that exchange electrical and chemical signals, and many aspects of mental life can be traced through those networks with remarkable precision. Light reaches the retina, signals move through visual pathways, activity changes across the cortex, and a scene becomes available for recognition. Sound enters the ear. Patterns of vibration become neural impulses, and the brain extracts pitch, language, location, and meaning. Damage to particular regions can alter memory, attention, speech, emotional regulation, or the ability to recognize faces. Drugs can shift mood and perception. Anesthesia can erase awareness for a time. Sleep changes the structure of experience without stopping the brain itself. These facts make consciousness look deeply dependent on physical processes. Yet dependence is not the same as explanation. And the unresolved gap appears at the point where measurable activity becomes experience. Neuroscience can record a neuron firing, detect a rhythm spreading through a network, or identify a brain state associated with seeing red, feeling pain, or recalling a childhood room. What remains harder to account for is why any of that activity is accompanied by an inner point of view at all. The brain does not merely respond to light. Under ordinary waking conditions, there is something it is like for a visual scene to be present. Pain is not only nociceptive processing and defensive behavior, it also hurts. A remembered melody is not only a stored pattern reactivated across neural circuits, it is heard inwardly as part of a stream of experience. This distinction sits close to what philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness, not the problem of how brains discriminate information, control behavior, integrate signals, or produce reports, but why physical processing should give rise to subjective experience in the first place. The distinction can be misleading if treated as a proof that current neuroscience must fail, because many researchers reject the idea that the hard problem marks a separate scientific category. Some argue that once the mechanisms of perception, attention, memory, self-modeling, and report are explained in sufficient detail, the apparent extra mystery may shrink or dissolve. Others think the explanatory gap is real and fundamental. The disagreement matters because it determines what kind of theory would count as progress. A theory that predicts whether a person is conscious under anesthesia may be valuable even if it says little about why experience exists. A theory that explains how information becomes globally available across the brain may clarify access and cognition while leaving subjective feeling untouched. A theory of consciousness, therefore, has to navigate two different demands. It must connect to observable brain function, and it must also clarify what exactly it claims to explain about experience. Modern neuroscience offers several powerful ways of approaching the first demand. Some models emphasize widespread communication between specialized brain systems. Others focus on recurrent processing, the looping exchange of signals within and between cortical regions. Still others examine complexity, integration, predictive processing, or the brain's continuous construction of models about the body and the surrounding world. These frameworks are not empty abstractions. They generate experiments, identify neural signatures, and help explain why awareness can disappear or fragment after injury, sleep, seizures, or anesthesia. The difficulty is that success at mapping the conditions associated with consciousness does not automatically settle the deeper question of what consciousness is. A thermometer can track temperature without explaining thermodynamics. In a similar way, a neural signature can correlate tightly with awareness while leaving open whether it is a cause, a consequence, a prerequisite, or only one visible part of a larger process. This is where the mystery becomes unusually persistent. The brain is not inaccessible in the way a distant galaxy is inaccessible. It is physical tissue that can be scanned, stimulated, modeled, recorded, and altered. Its cells obey chemistry, its membranes carry voltage, its synapses release molecules, its circuits change with learning. Yet the most immediate feature of mental life, subjective presence itself, does not appear in a microscope as a separate object. There is no small region containing redness, grief, familiarity, or the sense of self as isolated substances. Instead, those experiences correlate with distributed patterns that change across time. The temptation is to imagine that one more level of detail will reveal the missing ingredient, perhaps a special neuron, a hidden circuit, or an undiscovered coding scheme. But consciousness may not be an ingredient at all. It may be a property of organization, a dynamic relation among processes, or something that emerges only when matter is arranged and interacting in a particular way. The word emergence is useful, but it can also conceal the difficulty. Saying that consciousness emerges from neural activity does not yet explain the mechanism by which non-conscious physical events become a conscious state. Water is wet because molecular interactions generate macroscopic properties that individual molecules do not possess, and the steps between the microscopic and macroscopic descriptions can in principle be derived. Consciousness presents a stranger transition because the final property is not merely a new behavior seen from the outside. It includes an interior dimension, the existence of experience from within the system. That difference has encouraged proposals ranging from strictly biological theories to computational accounts, information-based models, panpsychist philosophies, and more speculative physical ideas. Most of these proposals remain within the assumption that the known operations of neurons and networks are sufficient in principle, even if the correct theory has not yet been found. Quantum theories become interesting precisely because they question that assumption. Their starting point is not simply that the brain is mysterious, nor that quantum mechanics is mysterious, and therefore the two mysteries should be joined. That would be scientifically weak. The stronger motivation is narrower. Perhaps some feature of consciousness cannot be fully captured by classical computation or conventional neural dynamics, and perhaps the brain contains physical processes at smaller scales that have been overlooked. This possibility remains far from established. But it becomes easier to understand once the limits of ordinary explanation are made clear. The electrical activity of neurons is real. Synaptic chemistry is real. Large-scale brain networks are real. None of these facts is threatened by asking whether another physical layer might matter. The question is whether such a layer is necessary. Any serious proposal must therefore do more than point to the strangeness of quantum physics. It must show a mechanism that can exist in the biological environment, influence neural function, produce predictions that differ from classical accounts, and survive experimental testing. Without those steps, quantum consciousness remains only an evocative label. With them, it becomes a scientific hypothesis that can at least be evaluated. The unsettling quality of the problem comes from the possibility that the familiar picture of the brain may be incomplete in a way that is difficult to detect. Neurons are large compared with molecules. Their spikes unfold over timescales that seem comfortably classical. Most successful neuroscience treats the brain as a network of cells, not as a quantum device. If consciousness can eventually be explained at that level, then the quantum route may prove unnecessary. But if some essential feature consistently escapes every classical account, the search may have to move downward, beneath neural firing and synaptic exchange, toward processes that ordinary models average away. That possibility does not yet provide an answer. It creates a threshold. Before quantum mechanics can be asked to explain consciousness, the case must first be made that the known language of neurons, circuits, and computation leaves something physically unfinished rather than merely philosophically uncomfortable. The central mystery therefore remains sharply defined. The brain can be observed producing the conditions under which consciousness appears. But the bridge from those conditions to experience has not yet been decisively described. The next step is to ask why quantum physics, of all possible deeper frameworks, was invited into that gap at all. Quantum mechanics enters the discussion of consciousness for a simple reason that is easy to overstate. The brain is made of matter, and matter at its deepest known level obeys quantum rules. Every atom in a neuron, every ion moving across a membrane, every electron involved in a chemical bond, and every molecule participating in synaptic transmission ultimately exists within a quantum description. That much is not controversial. The difficulty begins when this universal fact is turned into a stronger claim, because saying that the brain is quantum, in the same sense that all physical systems are quantum, is very different from saying that consciousness depends on specifically quantum effects that cannot be reduced to ordinary neural behavior. The distinction matters because quantum mechanics describes a world whose rules often resist everyday intuition at very small scales. A physical system can be represented as a combination of possible states rather than as a single definite condition. This is called superposition. It does not mean that a particle is simply hiding one ordinary state from observation. The quantum state carries multiple possibilities together in a mathematically precise way, and those possibilities can interfere with one another before a definite outcome is recorded. Quantum entanglement introduces another departure from classical expectations. Two systems can become correlated so deeply that their joint state cannot be fully described by treating each one independently, even when they later become widely separated. Measurement adds a further complication. The equations of quantum mechanics allow a state to evolve smoothly as a spread of possibilities, yet experiments produce definite results. How that transition should be understood remains one of the oldest conceptual disputes in modern physics. Different interpretations explain the same observed predictions in different ways, and no consensus has forced every physicist into a single picture of what the quantum state ultimately means. These features make quantum mechanics tempting whenever another scientific problem involves uncertainty, hidden structure, or unexplained transitions. Consciousness appears to contain all three, yet resemblance is not evidence. The strangeness of one subject cannot be used to solve the strangeness of another merely by placing them side by side. A useful quantum theory of consciousness must identify a process in the brain for which quantum behavior is not only present in principle, but functionally important. That requirement immediately narrows the field. Much of neural activity can be modeled effectively using classical physics. Neurons maintain voltage differences across their membranes because charged ions are distributed unevenly. When channels open, ions flow. Electrical signals propagate along axons. Chemical neurotransmitters cross synapses and alter the likelihood that neighboring cells will fire. None of these descriptions denies quantum mechanics at the molecular foundation, but the large-scale behavior is usually stable enough that quantum details average out. The same is true for countless physical systems. A falling stone is quantum matter, yet its trajectory does not require a calculation of quantum superposition. A heartbeat depends on molecular interactions governed ultimately by quantum chemistry. Yet cardiac rhythm can be studied without treating the heart as a quantum computer. The important scientific question is therefore not whether quantum mechanics exists in the brain. It unquestionably does. The question is whether the brain preserves, controls, or exploits particular quantum states in a way that changes cognition or generates consciousness. There are biological precedents for taking such a possibility seriously. Quantum biology has shown that living systems cannot always be understood by assuming quantum effects disappear completely at molecular scales. Electron tunneling can influence some biochemical reactions. Quantum behavior has been investigated in photosynthetic energy transfer, where molecular arrangements can support effects that are most naturally described with quantum dynamics. Radical pair mechanisms have been studied as a possible basis for magnetic sensitivity in some animals. These examples are important because they weaken an overly simple objection that warm biological systems can never exhibit meaningful quantum phenomena. Life does not create an exemption from physics, and under the right conditions, biological structures can make use of effects that classical intuition would miss. But these examples also impose a discipline on the discussion. In each case, the relevant quantum process must be connected to a specific molecular mechanism, timescale, environment, and observable consequence. A claim about consciousness must meet the same standard. It is not enough to point to quantum effects somewhere in biology and then extend them to thought. The brain would need structures capable of sustaining the relevant state long enough to matter, mechanisms that couple that state to neural activity, and predictions showing what changes when the quantum process is altered. This is where the gap between established quantum biology and quantum consciousness remains large. The brain is an extraordinarily active environment. Molecules collide continuously. Water surrounds cellular structures. Electrical fields fluctuate. Proteins bend, vibrate, bind, and release. Thermal motion is constant. These interactions tend to destroy delicate quantum relationships by entangling small systems with their surroundings. That process, known as decoherence, does not make quantum mechanics disappear. It makes distinct quantum possibilities become effectively classical when information about them spreads into the environment. For many proposed brain mechanisms, the central question is therefore one of survival. Can a biologically relevant quantum state remain coherent long enough, and in the right place, to influence a process connected to consciousness? The answer cannot be assumed from either side. Declaring it impossible because the brain is warm and wet is too crude. Because quantum biology shows that nature can sometimes protect useful quantum behavior. Declaring it plausible because quantum effects exist in biology is equally weak, because the specific physical requirements may be entirely different. The burden falls on the mechanism. This is why quantum consciousness proposals become more interesting, when they stop speaking broadly about observational mystery and begin naming actual structures. A serious model has to identify what is in superposition. What preserves coherence? What ends that coherence? How the outcome affects cellular behavior, and why that sequence should be associated with conscious experience rather than with ordinary chemistry. Without those details, language borrowed from quantum physics can become decorative. Terms such as entanglement, collapse, and uncertainty may sound profound while doing no explanatory work. The history of the subject contains many claims that move too quickly from quantum measurement to the role of an observer, and then from observer to human consciousness. Standard quantum experiments do not require a conscious mind in order to produce recorded outcomes. Detectors, environments, and physical interactions are enough to generate the observable results that experiments measure. Whatever the final interpretation of quantum measurement may be, no established result shows that human awareness causes ordinary quantum states to collapse. This point is essential because one of the most persistent misunderstandings surrounding quantum consciousness is the idea that physics has already placed mind outside the material world as a special agent. It has not. The stronger scientific proposals move in the opposite direction. They ask whether a physical quantum process inside the brain could contribute to the construction of consciousness. That preserves the brain as a physical system rather than treating consciousness as an external force acting on matter. Even then, the conceptual leap remains enormous. Quantum mechanics can describe probabilities, correlations, energy levels, and state evolution with extraordinary accuracy. None of those concepts contain subjective experience as an obvious term. A quantum event is not automatically a conscious event, any more than an electrical discharge is automatically a thought. A theory must explain why a particular quantum process should correspond to experience, and not merely demonstrate that such a process can occur. This is the pressure that gives the subject its scientific shape. Quantum physics offers mechanisms that are genuinely unlike classical computation, including superposition, interference, entanglement, and perhaps forms of state reduction whose interpretation remains unsettled. Consciousness presents a problem that some thinkers suspect may resist a purely computational account. The connection is therefore not logically absurd, but it is also not established by similarity. It requires an argument about what classical descriptions cannot do. A candidate quantum process capable of doing something different, and evidence that the brain actually uses it. That path leads away from vague appeals to quantum mystery and toward the specific reasoning of Roger Penrose. His starting point was not the claim that neurons are quantum objects. It was the more radical suspicion that human understanding may involve something that no algorithm, no matter how elaborate, can fully capture. If that suspicion is wrong, much of the motivation for a quantum theory of consciousness weakens. If it is right, then the search for consciousness may have to descend below computation itself into a layer of physics where the rules are not merely complicated, but fundamentally different. Roger Penrose entered the consciousness debate from an unusual direction. He was not primarily trying to explain neurons, anesthesia, or the microscopic structure of brain cells. His starting point was a question about mathematics and computation, whether every act of human reasoning could, in principle, be reproduced by an algorithm. An algorithm is a finite set of rules that transforms inputs into outputs through definite steps. Modern computers are extraordinarily powerful examples of this idea, and much of cognitive science has been built around the assumption that the brain may also be understood as an information processing system whose operations are, at least in principle, computational. Penrose challenged that assumption. He argued that certain forms of mathematical understanding seem to involve more than mechanical rule following, and he drew heavily on the incompleteness theorems developed by Kurt Gödel. Gödel showed that sufficiently powerful formal systems capable of expressing arithmetic contain statements that cannot be proved within those systems if the systems are consistent. A formal system can therefore be precise, rigorous, and productive, while still being unable to establish every truth expressible in its own language. Penrose treated this as more than a technical limitation in mathematical logic. He believed it pointed toward a deeper distinction between following a formal procedure and grasping the truth of a mathematical statement. In his argument, a human mathematician can sometimes recognize that a particular statement must be true even when a given formal system cannot prove it from within its own rules. If human understanding can perform that kind of step in a way that no fixed algorithm can reproduce, then the mind cannot be completely equivalent to an ordinary computational machine. This is a controversial interpretation of Gödel, and it is important to separate the theorem itself from Penrose's conclusion. Gödel's mathematical results are established. The claim that they demonstrate a non-computable element in human cognition is not. Critics have argued that human mathematicians are neither perfectly consistent nor equivalent to ideal formal systems, and that any attempt to use Gödel's theorem against machine intelligence can depend on assumptions about human reasoning that are much stronger than the theorem warrants. A person may believe a statement to be true and still be wrong. A human mind may also use changing strategies rather than one fixed formal system, while a sufficiently flexible computational model could in principle do something similar. These objections mean that Penrose's case does not function as a proof that brains transcend computation. It functions instead as the philosophical and mathematical motivation for his search. What makes that search unusual is the next step. Penrose did not conclude that consciousness must be immaterial. He moved in the opposite direction. If human thought contains a genuinely non-algorithmic element, then some physical process in the brain might also have to be non-algorithmic. Ordinary classical physics, at least in the forms most commonly used to describe machines and neural networks, appears deeply compatible with computation. A classical system can be complicated beyond practical simulation, yet still be governed by deterministic or probabilistic rules that can in principle be represented algorithmically. Penrose therefore looked toward a part of physics where the relationship between rules and outcomes is less straightforward quantum mechanics. Quantum theory already contains two very different kinds of evolution in its standard textbook presentation. One is the smooth, deterministic development of a quantum state according to the Schrödinger equation. The other is the appearance of a definite outcome when a measurement occurs, often described as collapse of the wave function. The first process is orderly and continuous. The second appears abrupt and probabilistic. Penrose became interested in the possibility that this second transition might not simply be an update of knowledge, or a consequence of an observer interacting with a system. Perhaps collapse is a real physical event, more radically. Perhaps the conditions that trigger it are tied to gravity and the structure of space-time itself. This is the seed of what he called objective reduction. The word objective is crucial. In this proposal, collapse would not require a conscious observer standing outside the quantum system. It would happen because the physical superposition itself becomes unstable under certain conditions. That idea allowed Penrose to connect two problems that are usually kept separate. One concerns the foundations of quantum mechanics and the unresolved meaning of measurement. The other concerns the possibility that human thought includes non-computable elements. If objective collapse is a genuine physical process, and if that process is fundamentally non-algorithmic, then a biological system capable of organizing such events might possess a form of information processing unavailable to an ordinary classical computer. That possibility is still several steps away from consciousness. A physical process can be non-computable without being mental, and a brain can contain unusual physics without that physics explaining subjective experience. Penrose nevertheless saw a route. The brain might not merely calculate through networks of neurons. It might exploit a deeper physical process in which quantum possibilities evolve, and then reach an objectively determined threshold where one outcome becomes real. The appeal of this picture lies partly in what it refuses to do. It does not assign consciousness the role of causing quantum collapse. Instead, it asks whether objective collapse could be part of the mechanism from which consciousness arises. This reverses a popular but misleading version of quantum mysticism. The mind is not placed above physics as an observer with special powers. It is placed deeper inside physics, dependent on a process that might not yet be fully understood. The difficulty is that each link in this chain carries uncertainty. Penrose's interpretation of Gödel does not command agreement. The existence of a physically real objective collapse mechanism has not been established. The idea that such collapse would be non-computable in the relevant sense remains theoretical. And even if all of those points were granted, a further explanation would still be needed to show why collapse should correspond to a moment of conscious experience. The argument is therefore best understood as a sequence of motivations rather than as a completed theory. Human mathematical insight may not be reducible to fixed algorithms. If so, cognition may require non-algorithmic physics. Quantum state reduction is a candidate for such physics. If state reduction is objective rather than observer-dependent, then it could occur inside the brain without invoking a separate mind outside matter. Each step creates a possible opening, but none closes the problem on its own. Penrose's proposal became much more concrete when it encountered the work of Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist who had been interested in structures inside neurons called microtubules. Hameroff believed that these structures might do more than support cell shape and transport material. He proposed that they could participate in information processing at a scale beneath ordinary neural firing. This gave Penrose something his earlier argument lacked: a candidate biological location. The combination was striking. Penrose had a speculative physical mechanism that might escape ordinary computation, but no clear place for it in the brain. Hameroff had a proposed subneuronal information system, but no established fundamental physical process that could turn it into a theory of consciousness. Their collaboration would eventually become Orch OR. But before that synthesis can be understood, the physics of objective reduction has to stand on its own. The key claim is not that quantum mechanics is mysterious enough to produce mind. It is that a superposition involving sufficiently different physical configurations might become unstable for an objective reason tied to space-time, and that the resulting reduction might represent a kind of event that no ordinary algorithm completely captures. If that mechanism exists, it would alter more than theories of consciousness. It would mean that the apparent split between smooth quantum evolution and definite outcomes reflects a real process in nature, rather than only an incomplete description. Penrose's path into consciousness therefore begins with a limit, not a limit of brain imaging, but a suspected limit of computation itself. Whether that limit truly exists remains disputed, yet it defines the next stage of the theory, because once ordinary calculation is judged insufficient, the burden shifts to physics to supply something genuinely different. Objective reduction begins with the tension already present inside ordinary quantum theory. A quantum state can evolve smoothly according to the equations that govern it, preserving a spread of possible outcomes, yet experiments eventually yield something definite. A detector clicks in one place rather than another. An atom is found in one state rather than a mixture of alternatives. A measurement ends with a result. In many practical calculations, this transition is handled without asking what physically happens during collapse, because the mathematics predicts experimental probabilities with extraordinary success. Penrose is interested in the point where that practical success leaves a conceptual opening. If a superposition represents more than incomplete knowledge, then different possible configurations are not merely different descriptions in a notebook. They correspond to genuinely different physical arrangements. Once gravity is included, Penrose argues, those arrangements may also imply slightly different geometries of space-time. That is where the proposal becomes unusual. General relativity treats gravity not as an ordinary force moving through a fixed background, but as the curvature of space-time produced by matter and energy. Quantum mechanics, by contrast, allows physical systems to exist in superpositions of different states. If a massive object occupies two sufficiently distinct configurations at once, then in a gravitational description each branch would be associated with a somewhat different space-time geometry. Penrose suggests that nature may not permit that ambiguity to persist indefinitely. The superposition may carry an intrinsic gravitational instability, and when that instability reaches a certain threshold, the state reduces objectively to one alternative. No observer is required. No measuring apparatus has to be granted a privileged status. The collapse is proposed to occur because the physical state itself has become unsustainable. This is why the idea is called objective reduction. It shifts collapse away from observation and into the dynamics of nature. The proposal is not part of established quantum mechanics, and it does not yet have the experimental status of the theories it tries to connect. Its importance comes from the type of gap it addresses. Standard quantum theory works extremely well, but its interpretations differ over what the formalism says is actually happening. Some approaches treat collapse as an update in description rather than as a new physical process. Others eliminate collapse entirely and allow all branches of the wave function to continue. Objective collapse models take another route by proposing that the superposition really does end through a physical mechanism. Penrose's version is distinctive because gravity is central to that mechanism. The deeper motivation comes from the incompatibility between the smooth geometry of general relativity and the superposed states of quantum theory. A fully successful theory of quantum gravity has not yet been established, so the exact behavior of space-time in a genuine quantum superposition remains unresolved. Penrose turns that unresolved region into a hypothesis. Perhaps superposed space-time geometries are not indefinitely stable. Perhaps the separation between them carries an energy cost associated with their gravitational difference. The greater the difference, the shorter the lifetime of the superposition. Small systems could remain coherent for relatively long periods because the gravitational distinction between alternatives is tiny. Larger or more widely separated mass distributions would reduce more quickly. This offers a physical reason why everyday objects do not appear in obvious macroscopic superpositions, even though quantum mechanics underlies their matter. The proposal therefore aims at a real boundary between quantum possibility and classical definiteness, not a boundary created only by observation. That boundary is central to Penrose's later connection with consciousness. If objective reduction is a genuine event, and if its timing depends on the physical structure of a superposition, then collapse is not merely random noise added to quantum evolution. Penrose has suggested that such events may contain a non-computable element tied to the deeper structure of space-time. This is the point where his earlier arguments about the limits of algorithmic reasoning re-enter the picture. A brain capable of organizing and exploiting objective reductions might, in principle, gain access to a process that ordinary digital computation does not reproduce. Yet even within this speculative framework, a crucial distinction remains. Objective reduction by itself is not a theory of consciousness. It is a proposed modification or completion of quantum dynamics. A collapsing quantum state in empty space would not automatically have thoughts, memories, or awareness. Something further is required to connect physical reduction to experience. Penrose's broader philosophical position suggests that fundamental features of experience may be linked to these reduction events, but that connection is not derived from established physics. It is a conjectural bridge. The scientific pressure therefore falls in two directions. The first is physical. Does gravity actually cause quantum superpositions to collapse in the way the proposal predicts? The second is biological. Could such collapses occur in the brain in a controlled pattern relevant to cognition? The first question can, at least in principle, be approached without solving consciousness. Experiments that place increasingly massive objects into quantum superposition can test whether coherence disappears according to ordinary environmental decoherence alone, or whether an additional collapse mechanism is needed. Advances in optomechanics, interferometry, cryogenic control, and levitated systems have gradually pushed quantum behavior into regimes involving larger objects and more massive structures. These experiments are difficult because environmental interactions imitate collapse so effectively. A stray photon, a vibration, thermal motion, or collision with surrounding particles can destroy coherence before any hypothetical gravitational mechanism has time to reveal itself. The experimental challenge is therefore to isolate a system well enough that ordinary decoherence becomes weaker than the effect being tested. So far, no decisive result has established Penrose-style gravitational objective reduction as a real process. The hypothesis remains open to testing rather than confirmed by observation. That status matters because Orch OR later depends on it. If objective reduction does not occur, then one of the central physical pillars of the consciousness theory disappears. Even if some objective collapse mechanism exists, it would still have to operate on the correct timescales and involve the correct physical degrees of freedom inside neurons. And even if those conditions were met, another gap would remain between a physical event and subjective awareness. Each layer therefore carries its own burden of evidence. This makes objective reduction more restrained than the popular idea that consciousness somehow causes quantum collapse. But it also makes it more demanding. It cannot survive on ambiguity about measurement alone. It needs a real instability, a measurable threshold, and eventually a connection to biology that produces unique predictions. The proposal's most interesting feature is also its greatest vulnerability. It tries to move the mystery out of interpretation and into physics. If collapse is objective, then it should leave consequences that do not depend on what anyone believes quantum mechanics means. Nature should behave differently from a theory in which superpositions persist until ordinary environmental interactions make them effectively classical. The distinction may be subtle, but it is not purely philosophical. That gives the idea a path toward falsification. At the same time, it creates a severe constraint on any consciousness theory built from it. A mechanism that has not yet been established in laboratory physics cannot simply be assumed to operate inside the brain. It must first survive increasingly careful tests in simpler systems. Only then does the biological question become serious. Penrose's argument therefore reaches a threshold rather than a conclusion. Objective reduction offers a possible physical event that is neither ordinary computation nor observer-driven collapse, but it remains hypothetical. To become relevant to consciousness, it still needs a structure in living neurons capable of sustaining quantum states, coordinating them, and coupling their reduction to brain activity. Hameroff believed that such a structure was already present, hidden not between neurons, but inside them. The proposed location was not the synapse, the axon, or the familiar electrical spike. It was the microtubule, a molecular scaffold already known to be essential for the architecture and internal organization of cells, and now asked to carry a far more controversial role. Microtubules are easy to overlook because they do not announce themselves through electrical spikes or obvious signals. They sit inside cells as part of the cytoskeleton, a structural network that helps give a cell its shape, organize its interior, and move material from one region to another. In neurons, their importance is especially clear. A single neuron can extend an axon across a remarkable distance compared with the size of its cell body, while dendrites branch in other directions to receive signals from neighboring cells. maintaining that geometry requires more than a membrane and a nucleus. It requires internal tracks, scaffolds, and transport systems capable of keeping distant parts of the cell supplied. Microtubules are central to that task. They are hollow cylindrical polymers built primarily from repeating pairs of proteins known as tubulin dimers. Each dimer contains two closely related forms of tubulin, and large numbers of these units assemble into long filaments with an ordered internal structure. The resulting tube is narrow on the scale of a cell but enormous compared with an individual molecule, placing it in an intermediate world between chemistry and cellular architecture. That scale became important to Stuart Hameroff because it suggested a possible level of organization beneath the neuron as a whole. In standard cell biology, microtubules already perform essential functions without requiring any unusual physics. They help maintain neuronal form. They participate in the internal arrangement of organelles. They provide tracks along which motor proteins move cargo, carrying vesicles, proteins, and other materials through axons and dendrites. Kinesin motors commonly move cargo toward one end of a microtubule, while dynein motors often move in the opposite direction. This transport is not a minor housekeeping detail. Neurons depend on constant movement of material over distances that can be extremely large at the cellular scale. Synapses require proteins and vesicles. Damaged components must be returned or replaced. Signals originating far from the nucleus may influence gene activity in the cell body. A neuron that loses control of its internal transport can lose function, even if its membrane remains electrically excitable. Microtubules therefore belong to the ordinary machinery of life, not to a speculative layer added from outside biology. Their established roles are already substantial. They're also dynamic. Tubulin units can assemble and disassemble, allowing microtubules to change length and organization as cells develop, adapt, and respond to internal conditions. In dividing cells, microtubules form the spindle that helps separate chromosomes. Mature neurons do not usually divide, but their microtubule networks remain crucial for maintaining long processes and supporting structural change. This combination of order and flexibility helped make them attractive to proposals about information processing. Hameroff's suggestion was that a neuron might not be best understood only as a single switching unit, receiving inputs and producing an output spike. Inside each neuron, he argued, there could be a much richer level of organization in which microtubules participate in processing information before any electrical signal appears at the cell membrane. That idea reaches beyond the established functions of the cytoskeleton. Cell biology supports the importance of microtubules in structure, transport, and intracellular organization. It does not by itself establish that they perform quantum computation, store conscious content, or generate subjective experience. The distinction is essential because Orch OR depends on assigning microtubules a role far more specific than conventional neuroscience requires. Hameroff was drawn in part to the molecular structure of tubulin. Proteins are not rigid objects. They can change shape, interact with neighboring molecules, bind chemical partners, and respond to their local electrical environment. Tubulin is no exception. In principle, different molecular conformations could influence how microtubules behave and how they interact with other cellular components. Hameroff proposed that patterns within tubulin could function somewhat like a computational substrate, with states distributed across the microtubule lattice, rather than confined to the membrane of the neuron. In the Orch OR picture, this molecular organization becomes the stage on which quantum states might be prepared, coordinated, and eventually reduced. Yet before quantum mechanics enters, the biological proposal itself already changes the scale of the consciousness problem. Conventional descriptions often move from synapses to neurons, from neurons to networks, and from networks to large-scale patterns across the brain. Hameroff inserts another level below the neuron and asks whether events inside the cell could influence what the network is able to do. That question is not unreasonable in its general form. Neurons are not featureless electrical nodes. Their internal chemistry affects excitability, growth, plasticity, metabolism, and survival. Receptors move, proteins are modified, gene expression changes, cytoskeletal structures reorganize. Signals inside the cell can alter how the neuron responds minutes, hours, or longer into the future. The controversial step is not the claim that intracellular processes matter. The controversial step is the claim that a particular intracellular structure supports coherent quantum states that are directly relevant to consciousness. For that reason, the microtubule occupies an unusual position in the theory. It is neither invented nor hypothetical. Its existence and many of its functions are firmly established. What remains hypothetical is the additional role assigned to it. That mixture can make the theory sound more secure than it is. A real biological structure can serve as the foundation of a speculative mechanism, without confirming that mechanism. The same distinction appears throughout science. A molecule may exist without performing a proposed signaling role. A brain region may activate during a task without being the sole cause of that task. A correlation can be real while the interpretation remains unsettled. With microtubules, the physical substrate is real, but the claim that they host the quantum dynamics required by Orch OR remains under debate. The theory also has to explain how activity inside microtubules would affect the larger neuron. Consciousness, whatever its mechanism, is tightly linked to changes in brain state. Perception can shift with cortical activity. Anesthesia can suppress awareness. Damage to neural circuits can remove specific capacities. Any microtubule-based mechanism must therefore connect upward into membrane excitability, synaptic transmission, network timing, or some other process capable of shaping large-scale neural dynamics. Without such a bridge, even an elaborate molecular computation would remain isolated from the known physiology associated with conscious states. Hameroff's broader proposal attempts to provide that bridge by treating microtubule processes as orchestrated by ordinary cellular activity. Synaptic inputs, biochemical conditions, and other neural events would influence the molecular states inside the neuron, while the resulting microtubule dynamics would feed back into cellular function. This is the meaning carried by the word orchestrated in Orch OR. The quantum process is not imagined as random activity floating beneath the neuron. It is supposed to be organized by biology. The appeal of that arrangement is clear. It places the speculative physics inside a structure already embedded in neural function. Rather than proposing an entirely separate organ of consciousness, it also creates the possibility that large-scale brain activity and microscopic events could constrain one another. But the same arrangement creates severe experimental demands. If microtubules truly perform a special information processing role relevant to awareness, then changes to that role should have effects distinguishable from the many ordinary consequences of disturbing the cytoskeleton. Microtubules are so important to cell health that damaging them can alter transport, shape, and viability. A change in cognition after microtubule disruption would therefore not automatically reveal anything quantum. The effect could arise from conventional cellular failure. The more central a structure is to ordinary biology, the harder it can be to isolate an exotic additional function. This is one reason microtubules are both an attractive and difficult candidate. Their complexity provides room for sophisticated behavior, but their ordinary responsibilities create many alternative explanations. Even so, they supply something Penrose's earlier work lacked. Objective reduction was a proposed physical event without a clear biological home. Hameroff offered a structure small enough to make quantum questions conceivable, organized enough to suggest coordinated states, and important enough to influence neuronal function if such states existed. The combination transformed two separate ideas into a single theory. The next question is therefore no longer whether microtubules are important. That is already known. The question is whether their importance extends into a regime where molecular organization, quantum coherence, and objective collapse can be joined into a mechanism of conscious experience. That is the point at which Orch OR takes its full form, and where the proposal becomes both more specific and far easier to challenge. Orchestrated objective reduction is the point where the separate ideas of Penrose and Hameroff become a single theory of consciousness. Penrose contributes the proposed physical event and objective collapse of a quantum state when a threshold connected to space-time geometry is reached. Hameroff contributes the proposed biological setting, organized quantum processes inside microtubules within neurons. Orch OR joins them by suggesting that quantum states in microtubules do not merely arise and disappear randomly. They are shaped by the biological activity of the neuron, allowed to evolve for a limited period, and then terminated by objective reduction. The resulting collapse event is proposed to correspond to a discrete moment of conscious experience. This is the core claim, and it is much more specific than the broad statement that consciousness is somehow quantum. The theory requires a sequence. Microtubule states must first be capable of supporting relevant quantum behavior. Those states must then remain coherent long enough to develop. Neural and cellular activity must organize or orchestrate their evolution. The superposition must reach the condition required for objective reduction. Finally, the collapse must somehow be connected to a conscious moment rather than to an ordinary physical transition with no experiential significance. Every part of that sequence matters, because removing any one of them changes the theory substantially. The orchestration is especially important. In Penrose's original physical proposal, objective collapse could occur wherever suitable quantum conditions arose. Hameroff's contribution was to argue that the brain might actively shape those conditions. Synaptic inputs, membrane activity, biochemical signals, and the internal state of the neuron would influence what happened inside microtubules. The microtubules would therefore not behave like isolated quantum systems sealed away from biology. They would be embedded in it. Their proposed quantum states would reflect the activity of the surrounding cell, and the results of their reduction would feed back into neural function. In this picture, consciousness is neither purely a large-scale network phenomenon nor purely a microscopic quantum event. It appears at the point where the two levels meet. Ordinary neural activity provides the organization. Quantum evolution provides the underlying state space. Objective reduction provides the transition. The conscious moment is proposed to be associated with that transition. This layered structure helps explain why Orch OR has attracted both interest and criticism. It does not merely place quantum vocabulary over neuroscience. It attempts to connect a definite biological structure with a definite physical hypothesis. That specificity makes the theory vulnerable, because each part can be questioned separately. It also makes the proposal more scientifically meaningful than claims that treat quantum mechanics as a metaphor for awareness. Hameroff and Penrose describe conscious experience as occurring in a sequence of moments, rather than as an absolutely smooth and continuous stream. In Orch OR, each orchestrated reduction contributes one such moment, and the apparent continuity of experience emerges from the succession and organization of many events over time. This idea has an intuitive attraction because perception already has temporal structure. Brain activity unfolds in rhythms, attention fluctuates. Sensory processing is divided across windows of integration rather than occurring in an infinitely fine continuum. But none of that establishes that quantum collapse is the mechanism producing those windows. Classical neural dynamics can also generate oscillations, synchronization, recurrent activity, and discrete transitions between states. The burden of Orch OR is therefore to show why the proposed quantum events explain something that known neural processes cannot explain on their own. The theory also assigns a deeper significance to objective reduction than physics alone requires. Penrose has suggested that objective collapse events might be associated with fundamental features of space-time itself, and Orch OR links such events with primitive moments of experience. This is one of the most philosophically ambitious parts of the proposal. Consciousness is not treated as something that suddenly appears only when a sufficiently complicated neural network is assembled. Instead, the physical events underlying it are proposed to have roots in fundamental physics, while biological organization gives those events structure, content, and cognitive relevance. Such a view would make consciousness dependent on the deep architecture of nature rather than only on the computational behavior of cells. Yet this is also the point where the evidential gap becomes widest. Physics has not established that objective reductions carry experiential properties. Neuroscience has not established that moments of awareness correspond to collapse events inside microtubules. The theory proposes this bridge. It does not derive it from confirmed observations. The concept of orchestration is intended to prevent the mechanism from becoming arbitrary. If every objective collapse event everywhere were equivalent to a conscious moment, then consciousness would become almost indistinguishable from a universal property assigned to physical reduction. Orch OR instead emphasizes organized biological conditions. Microtubule states are proposed to be influenced by the structure and activity of neurons, so that reductions occur within a context shaped by sensory input, memory, synaptic activity, and cellular regulation, in principle. This could allow different patterns of reduction to correspond to different contents of experience. A visual perception, a remembered sound, or a decision would not arise from collapse in isolation, but from collapse occurring within a particular organized neural state. The word orchestrated therefore carries much of the theory's explanatory burden. It has to account for how fundamental quantum events become relevant to the specific and structured character of consciousness. This also creates a scale problem. Subjective experience reflects information distributed across many brain regions, yet the proposed quantum states are located within microscopic structures inside individual neurons. The theory must therefore explain coordination across levels. Local microtubule processes would need to influence larger neural dynamics, and large-scale neural activity would need to shape those local processes in return. Without such interaction, the microscopic events would be too isolated to explain the integrated nature of awareness. Orch OR proposes that cellular and network activity provides the necessary coordination, but demonstrating this experimentally remains difficult. Neural tissue contains countless interactions happening simultaneously, most of them entirely understandable through ordinary chemistry and electrophysiology. Detecting a specifically quantum contribution requires separating it from this dense classical background. The theory becomes even more demanding when timing is considered. Quantum states relevant to consciousness would have to persist long enough to be organized, but not so long that they become disconnected from rapid neural processing. They would also have to survive the disruptive influence of the cellular environment. If decoherence destroys the required states almost immediately, the entire mechanism fails before objective reduction can perform the role assigned to it. If coherence can survive, the theory still has to show that those states are biologically controlled and causally important. These are not secondary technical questions. They determine whether Orch OR can exist as a physical mechanism at all. The attraction of the proposal lies in how many difficult problems it attempts to touch at once. It offers a possible non-algorithmic process for Penrose's concerns about computation. It gives Hameroff's microtubules a role beyond structural cell biology. It proposes a physical transition that could divide consciousness into moments. It tries to connect those moments to fundamental space-time rather than leaving subjective experience as an unexplained byproduct of neural complexity. But bringing several unresolved problems together does not automatically solve them. It can also multiply uncertainty. If objective reduction is wrong, the central collapse mechanism disappears. If microtubules cannot sustain the necessary quantum states, the biological platform disappears. If such states exist but have no effect on neural computation, the mechanism becomes irrelevant to cognition. If reductions affect neurons but have no connection to subjective experience, the theory still fails as an account of consciousness. Orch OR therefore stands or falls through a chain of linked claims rather than a single dramatic prediction. This is precisely why it can be discussed as a scientific hypothesis rather than as a purely mystical idea. Its components can, at least in principle, be investigated. Quantum behavior in biological structures can be measured. Microtubule dynamics can be studied. Anesthetic effects can be compared with proposed molecular mechanisms. Predictions about coherence and collapse can be confronted with experiments. The theory remains speculative, but it does not have to remain permanently beyond testing. The immediate challenge is more basic than consciousness itself. Before a collapse event can be connected to experience, the brain must first demonstrate that the required quantum state can survive long enough to exist. That question shifts the argument away from philosophy and toward the physical conditions of living tissue, where temperature, water, molecular collisions, and environmental interaction become the next barrier the theory must cross. Quantum biology begins with a correction to an old intuition. Warm, wet, chemically active environments do not automatically erase every quantum effect before biology can use it. Living systems are made from molecules, and molecular processes are quantum at their foundation. The real question is whether specifically quantum features such as coherent superposition, tunneling, or spin-dependent dynamics can survive long enough and remain organized enough to influence a biological function in a way that cannot be captured adequately by a purely classical description. In several areas of biology, the answer appears to be at least partly yes. This matters for theories such as Orch OR, because one of the strongest objections to quantum consciousness has always been environmental fragility. If delicate quantum states cannot persist inside living tissue, then any model that relies on them fails before questions about consciousness even begin. Quantum biology does not remove that difficulty, but it changes it from a simple impossibility claim into a more precise problem of mechanism, timescale, and protection. One of the most widely discussed examples comes from photosynthesis. When certain light-harvesting molecules absorb energy from sunlight, that energy has to move toward reaction centers where it can be converted into chemical form. Experiments on some photosynthetic complexes have revealed signatures that were interpreted as evidence of coherent quantum dynamics during part of this transfer. The idea is not that a leaf behaves like a general-purpose quantum computer. It is that molecular structures may allow energy to explore pathways in a way influenced by quantum effects before interactions with the surrounding environment destroy the coherence. Later work has complicated the earliest interpretations, and the exact biological significance of long-lived coherence remains debated. But the important lesson survives in a narrower form. Biological systems can create molecular environments in which quantum dynamics persist long enough to become scientifically relevant. Another example involves electron tunneling. In classical physics, a particle without enough energy to cross a barrier should remain on one side. Quantum mechanics allows a finite probability that it can appear across the barrier instead. Tunneling contributes to some chemical and enzymatic reactions, where the motion of electrons or light nuclei can occur in ways that classical pictures alone would describe poorly. Again, the existence of the quantum effect is not mysterious. Chemistry itself depends on quantum mechanics. What becomes biologically interesting is whether molecular structure tunes the rate, geometry, or probability of that process in ways that help a reaction proceed efficiently. A third area concerns spin chemistry and animal magnetoreception. The radical pair mechanism proposes that chemical reactions involving pairs of molecules with correlated electron spins can be influenced by weak magnetic fields. This has become a leading physical framework for explaining how some animals might sense the direction of Earth's magnetic field. The mechanism remains an active research area, but it demonstrates a crucial point for the consciousness debate. Quantum properties can, under certain conditions, remain sensitive to extraordinarily weak environmental influences inside a biological system. Nature does not need to defeat decoherence everywhere. It only needs to preserve the relevant information for as long as a useful biochemical process requires. That is a much less dramatic claim than a quantum brain, yet it forces the discussion to become more careful. A living system can protect or exploit a fragile state if its molecular architecture constrains interactions appropriately, if the process happens quickly enough, or if the relevant quantum variable couples only weakly to disruptive surroundings. Coherence does not have to last for seconds to matter. In molecular systems, even extremely short-lived quantum behavior can affect an outcome if the reaction itself occurs on comparable timescales. This is where Orch OR encounters a much harder requirement. Conscious cognition unfolds across timescales, associated with neural signaling, oscillations, integration, and changing network states. A proposed quantum event inside microtubules would therefore need not merely to exist, but to remain relevant long enough to become connected with those slower biological processes. The fact that quantum effects can matter in photosynthetic complexes or spin chemistry does not show that the same kind of protection exists in tubulin. Different systems involve different particles, couplings, energies, temperatures, and environmental interactions. A mechanism that works for an electron transfer across a molecule cannot simply be transferred by analogy to superposition, extending across a large protein assembly. The scale of the proposed state matters. So does the degree of isolation it requires. This distinction is often lost when quantum biology is used as general evidence for quantum consciousness. The strongest conclusion supported by quantum biology is that warm biological environments are not universally hostile to every non-classical effect. The much stronger conclusion that neuronal microtubules sustain coherent quantum states capable of influencing conscious processing requires its own evidence. Orch therefore needs a biological form of quantum protection that is specific, measurable, and functionally connected to neuronal activity. Several possibilities have been proposed in discussions around the theory. Ordered regions inside microtubules might create local environments different from the surrounding cytoplasm. Water molecules near protein surfaces may behave differently from bulk water. Molecular vibrations, collective modes, or electrical properties of tubulin might influence how energy and information move through the structure. Some advocates have suggested that these features could reduce the rate at which relevant quantum states lose coherence. Such ideas are physically conceivable in a broad sense, because biological molecules do create structured local environments. But conceivability is not evidence that the required state actually exists. Each protective mechanism must be demonstrated under realistic biological conditions and shown to preserve the particular quantum variables that Orch OR needs. The challenge is especially severe because microtubules are not isolated objects. They interact with proteins, ions, water, membranes, motor molecules, and the surrounding cytoskeleton. They bend, grow, shrink, undergo chemical modification, and participate in active transport. Every one of those interactions creates potential channels through which information about a quantum state can leak into the environment. Once that information disperses, coherent alternatives cease to interfere in the way required for many forms of quantum processing. This does not mean that all quantum behavior ends. It means that the system begins to behave effectively classically at the level being considered. A successful microtubule model must therefore identify what stays coherent despite this constant contact. There is another complication. Even finding quantum coherence in microtubules would not by itself validate Orch OR. Coherence can exist without computation. Computation can occur without consciousness, and consciousness can correlate with a system that contains quantum effects without being caused by them. The evidence has to form a causal chain. A relevant quantum state must appear in living neuronal microtubules. Its properties must change in a predictable way with brain function. Altering that state while preserving ordinary cellular processes should alter cognition or consciousness in a distinctive manner. The effect should resist explanation by conventional chemistry, electrophysiology, or structural disruption. Only then would quantum biology begin to become quantum neuroscience, rather than an analogy borrowed from another field. This standard is demanding, but it is necessary because the brain offers many classical routes to complexity. Neural networks already produce integration, nonlinear behavior, synchronization, adaptation, memory, and state transitions without requiring macroscopic quantum coherence. A quantum explanation must therefore earn its place by explaining or predicting something that those mechanisms cannot. The existence of biological quantum effects raises the ceiling of plausibility, but it does not lower the burden of proof. In that sense, quantum biology changes the Orch OR debate in a subtle way. It prevents the theory from being dismissed merely because the brain is alive, warm, and wet. At the same time, it removes an easy defense from its supporters. Once useful quantum behavior in biology is accepted as possible, the conversation has to move from possibility to measurement. The relevant question is no longer whether life can ever exploit quantum mechanics. It can. The question is whether the brain preserves the particular kind of coherence that Orch OR requires in the particular structures it identifies for the particular duration and functional role the theory demands. That narrower question leads directly to the theory's most persistent physical obstacle. In a cell crowded with moving molecules and continuous thermal activity, coherence is not merely difficult to create, it is constantly being lost. The next challenge is therefore not whether quantum states can exist in biology, but whether the proposed states inside the brain can survive decoherence long enough to matter. Decoherence is the point where many quantum theories of consciousness encounter their most severe physical constraint. A quantum state can preserve relationships between alternative possibilities only while those relationships remain sufficiently isolated from the surrounding environment. Once the system begins interacting strongly with nearby particles, fields, vibrations, or thermal motion, information about the alternative spreads outward. The state does not cease to obey quantum mechanics, but the interference between its components becomes effectively inaccessible. At the scale of ordinary observation, the system begins to behave classically. This process is called decoherence, and in a living brain the possible sources of it are everywhere. Neurons exist in warm tissue filled with water, ions, proteins, fluctuating electrical fields, moving molecular structures, and constant chemical activity. Microtubules are immersed in that environment rather than shielded from it. Any proposal that depends on coherent quantum states persisting inside them must therefore explain how those states avoid being washed into the surroundings before they can influence neural function. This concern became especially influential through calculations by physicist Max Tegmark, who examined whether proposed quantum superpositions in the brain could survive for biologically meaningful periods. His estimates suggested extraordinarily short decoherence times for certain kinds of superposed states associated with neural or intracellular processes. The exact values depended on the physical assumptions built into the models, but the larger implication was difficult to ignore. If coherence disappears many orders of magnitude faster than neural processing unfolds, then the brain cannot rely on those states in the way a quantum computer relies on carefully preserved quantum information. A state that loses coherence almost immediately has no opportunity to participate in a long orchestrated process leading to a conscious event. For Orch OR, this criticism strikes near the center of the theory, because orchestration requires time. The proposed microtubule states must be influenced by cellular activity, evolve in a coordinated form, and reach the condition for objective reduction. If environmental decoherence ends the relevant superposition first, then ordinary interactions with the surroundings perform the decisive transition before Penrose's gravitational mechanism can become important. Objective reduction would then be physically irrelevant inside the brain, even if it existed elsewhere in nature. Supporters of Orch OR have disputed whether the original decoherence estimates apply to the states their theory actually requires. They have argued that assumptions about charge separation, geometry, environmental coupling, and the specific degrees of freedom involved may not accurately represent microtubule dynamics. A model that treats a proposed quantum state as a large exposed separation of electrical charge may predict a much shorter lifetime than a model involving more subtle collective variables. They have also pointed toward structural order inside microtubules and toward possible shielding or dynamical effects that might extend coherence. These responses identify an important principle. Decoherence time is not a single property of the brain. It depends on what is placed into superposition, how strongly that variable interacts with the environment, what temperature and molecular conditions surround it, and what timescale the biological mechanism actually needs. A careless calculation can therefore be misleading if it evaluates the wrong physical state. Yet this cuts in both directions. Rejecting one estimate does not demonstrate that the required coherence survives. It shifts the burden toward constructing a better model and then showing experimentally that the proposed state behaves as predicted. The central issue is not whether warm biological matter can ever sustain quantum effects. As quantum biology demonstrates, some quantum processes can operate under biological conditions. The issue is whether the specific coherent states demanded by Orch OR can remain physically meaningful in neuronal microtubulars for long enough to contribute to consciousness. That requirement is far more restrictive. Some biological quantum effects act over extremely short distances and times, where even a fragile state can alter a chemical reaction before decoherence dominates. Orch OR requires more than a fleeting molecular correction. It requires coordinated information-bearing states, embedded within neuronal biology, that can become sufficiently organized for an objective reduction event to carry functional significance. The precise duration required depends on the formulation of the theory, but the process must somehow connect microscopic quantum dynamics to neural events unfolding at much slower scales. This separation of timescales is one reason the decoherence problem remains powerful, even after simple objections about warm tissue are softened. A brief quantum effect can matter in chemistry without forming a stable computational resource. Consciousness theories need to show why the quantum state persists in the form they require and how its influence survives the transition upward into cellular behavior. The environment also creates a conceptual complication for objective reduction. Penrose's mechanism is supposed to end a superposition because of an intrinsic instability related to gravitational differences between possible states. Decoherence, however, can make the system effectively classical through ordinary interaction long before that intrinsic threshold is reached. The two processes are not equivalent. Environmental decoherence does not necessarily select a single unique outcome in every interpretation of quantum mechanics, whereas objective collapse is proposed as a genuine physical reduction. But for a biological mechanism, what matters is whether the coherent superposition remains intact long enough for the distinction to matter at all. If the environment has already dispersed the phase relationships that Orch OR depends upon, then a later gravitational reduction cannot recover the lost quantum organization. The theory therefore requires a regime in which environmental decoherence is sufficiently suppressed relative to the proposed objective reduction timescale. Demonstrating such a regime inside living neurons would be a major experimental result. So far, that requirement has not been decisively established. This does not make decoherence a proof that Orch OR is impossible. Decoherence calculations always rely on assumptions, and biological structures can sometimes behave in ways that simple models overlook. Molecular environments are heterogeneous. Proteins contain pockets, ordered domains, and dynamic modes. Cells actively maintain chemical gradients and structural organization far from equilibrium. It is scientifically reasonable to investigate whether these features create protected quantum variables. What cannot be assumed is that complexity itself provides protection. A complicated molecule is not automatically a coherent quantum device, and biological organization does not suspend the coupling between a system and its surroundings. Protection has to arise from a specific physical mechanism. In engineered quantum technologies, maintaining coherence is one of the central technical challenges. Systems are isolated, cooled, corrected, controlled, and measured with extreme care because unwanted environmental interaction rapidly destroys the quantum information being preserved. The brain does none of this in the same obvious way. If it achieves an equivalent function through biological means, identifying that mechanism would itself be a discovery of considerable importance. Or therefore sits in an unusual position. The theory does not need microtubules to resemble laboratory quantum computers in every respect, but it does need them to perform something comparably demanding: maintain the relevant non-classical state against environmental disruption until the proposed reduction becomes functionally significant. Evidence of unusual electrical behavior, collective vibrations, or ordered water near microtubules may be interesting, but none of these observations alone establishes the required coherence. The relevant experiment must identify a genuinely quantum signature, determine how long it survives under realistic cellular conditions, and connect its disruption to a consequence that cannot be explained more simply by ordinary changes in protein function. This is difficult because microtubules are biologically active structures even without any quantum conscious role. Any intervention that alters their physical state can also alter transport, cellular organization, signaling, or structural stability. A resulting change in brain function would therefore need careful interpretation. The decoherence debate ultimately forces the theory toward precision. Broad claims that the brain is too warm for quantum effects are insufficient. Broad claims that quantum biology proves the brain can preserve coherence are also insufficient. The decisive question concerns one proposed state, in one biological structure, under one set of realistic conditions, for one functionally relevant period. Until that state is observed and characterized, the physical foundation of Orch OR remains uncertain. Yet decoherence does more than threaten the theory. It also points toward a possible route for testing it. If consciousness depends on carefully maintained quantum organization in microtubules, then agents or conditions that selectively disrupt that organization should alter consciousness in a distinctive way. That possibility leads toward one of the most intriguing experimental clues associated with Orch OR, because medicine already possesses compounds capable of turning consciousness off while leaving much of the body's basic cellular machinery alive. General anesthesia therefore becomes more than a clinical phenomenon. Within the logic of the theory, it becomes a place where the proposed quantum process might finally leave a measurable biological trace. General anesthesia creates an unusually useful problem for theories of consciousness, because it can remove awareness without stopping the brain from functioning as living tissue. Neurons remain metabolically active. Blood continues to circulate. Cells continue exchanging ions, maintaining membranes, transporting molecules, and carrying out the biochemical work required for survival. Yet somewhere within that still active system, the capacity for conscious experience can disappear with remarkable reliability. The transition is reversible. As the anesthetic concentration falls, awareness can return without the brain having to rebuild itself from the beginning. This makes anesthesia different from catastrophic brain injury, coma caused by widespread damage, or the gradual loss of function produced by degenerative disease. It allows consciousness to be turned off and restored, while much of the underlying biological machinery remains intact. For neuroscience, this provides a powerful way to examine which forms of brain activity are necessary for awareness. For Orch OR, it creates a more specific possibility. If consciousness depends on organized quantum processes inside microtubules, then general anesthetics might interfere with that process in a way that helps reveal where the mechanism resides. The ordinary pharmacology of anesthesia is already complex enough to demand caution. Different anesthetic agents do not all act through one receptor or one molecular pathway. Some enhance inhibitory signaling, others reduce excitatory transmission. Some alter membrane proteins, ion channels, synaptic release, or network communication in different combinations. At larger scales, anesthesia changes how brain regions interact, alters patterns of cortical activity, disrupts long-range communication, and changes the complexity and integration of neural signals. These observations provide entirely classical routes by which consciousness can disappear. A quantum theory must therefore explain not merely why anesthetics affect the brain, but why their effects on consciousness point specifically toward microtubules or quantum coherence, rather than toward known synaptic and network mechanisms. Hameroff has long been interested in anesthesia, partly because many general anesthetics are chemically diverse yet converge on the same broad functional outcome. This has encouraged the search for molecular features they might share. Earlier theories of anesthesia focused heavily on lipid membranes, while later work identified important interactions with proteins, including receptors and ion channels. Within the Orch OR framework, attention turns toward the possibility that anesthetic molecules also interact with hydrophobic regions in proteins such as tubulin. Hydrophobic regions are areas where nonpolar molecular groups tend to avoid direct contact with water, and proteins often contain internal pockets with such properties. If anesthetic molecules bind within or near these regions, they can alter protein dynamics without necessarily destroying the protein or preventing all of its ordinary cellular functions. For a conventional biological model, such binding might matter because it changes protein shape, interactions, or signaling. For Orch OR, the suggestion becomes more ambitious. If quantum states relevant to consciousness depend on particular electronic, vibrational, or conformational properties within tubulin, then anesthetic binding might disturb those states and weaken the orchestration required for objective reduction. The attraction of this idea is that it could, in principle, connect a molecular event to a global change in conscious state. The brain does not have to be shut down completely. The proposed quantum organization only has to be disrupted enough that conscious moments no longer form in the required way. This would fit the clinical fact that deeply anesthetized patients can remain biologically active while lacking ordinary awareness. Yet the same fact is also compatible with conventional neuroscience, because consciousness may depend on large-scale patterns of communication that anesthetics disrupt without silencing every neuron. The evidence, therefore, has to do more than show that anesthetics interact with tubulin. Tubulin participates in ordinary cellular function, and anesthetics can interact with many proteins. A binding event becomes relevant to Orch OR only if it alters a specifically quantum property, and if that alteration is causally connected to the loss of consciousness. This distinction is where the hypothesis moves from suggestive to testable. One experimental strategy would be to determine whether anesthetic molecules change measurable properties of microtubules under controlled conditions while preserving their basic structural integrity. Another would be to identify a quantum signature associated with microtubule states and test whether anesthetic exposure changes that signature at concentrations comparable to those that produce unconsciousness. A stronger result would show that the quantum change tracks loss and return of consciousness more closely than conventional molecular or network effects do. Stronger still would be an intervention that selectively preserves the proposed quantum process while leaving the anesthetic present. If consciousness also remained preserved, the result would create serious pressure on purely classical explanations. No such decisive chain has been established. Current evidence does not demonstrate that general anesthesia causes unconsciousness by disrupting quantum computation in microtubules. The fact that anesthesia remains an active area for Orch OR research reflects the possibility of generating discriminating experiments, not the existence of a confirmed mechanism. This is an important difference because anesthesia can easily create misleading correlations. If an anesthetic changes microtubule behavior, that change could be downstream of altered cellular metabolism. It could be one of many parallel effects. It could influence ordinary intracellular transport rather than consciousness directly. Or it could reflect protein interactions that have nothing to do with coherent quantum states. A causal theory has to separate these alternatives. The timing of anesthesia adds another useful constraint. Loss of consciousness can occur relatively quickly as drug concentration changes, and recovery can follow as molecules redistribute or leave their targets. A proposed microtubule mechanism would therefore have to respond on compatible timescales. It would also need to explain differences among anesthetic agents and why some compounds with related physical properties do not produce identical effects. The more a theory can connect molecular structure, binding behavior, neural state, and conscious outcome, the more informative the test becomes. Orch OR gains scientific value when it makes predictions that could fail. If anesthesia affects consciousness entirely through receptors, channels, and network dynamics, while microtubule quantum properties remain unchanged or irrelevant, then a central line of support for the theory weakens. If specific anesthetic effects on tubulin are found, but can be explained completely through classical protein chemistry, the result still does not establish quantum consciousness. Only evidence that requires the quantum layer would shift the balance. Anesthesia therefore serves as a revealing boundary between what Orch OR proposes and what ordinary neuroscience already explains. Classical models have substantial evidence that anesthetics alter communication across neural systems, reduce effective connectivity, change oscillatory patterns, and disturb the integration of information. None of this answers the deepest philosophical question of why awareness exists, but it does explain important conditions under which awareness is present or absent. Orch OR proposes that beneath those changes lies another interruption, one occurring inside the molecular architecture of neurons. The theory would become much stronger if that hidden interruption could be detected directly and shown to precede or determine the larger network effects. Without such evidence, the microtubule interpretation remains one possible layer among many. There is also a conceptual advantage to studying anesthesia that extends beyond Orch OR. Any serious theory of consciousness should eventually explain why a person can move from wakefulness into a state with no reportable experience and later return. The transition forces a theory to identify what physical process has changed. A model based on global neural communication must specify how connectivity collapses and recovers. A model based on information integration must specify which measurable properties vanish. A quantum model must identify the relevant quantum state, show how anesthesia disrupts it, and demonstrate that restoration of that state accompanies the return of awareness. This is where scientific theories become vulnerable in a productive way. The more precisely they describe the switch, the easier it becomes to test whether the proposed mechanism is actually present. For Orch OR, anesthesia is therefore not evidence of victory. It is a possible experimental doorway. The compounds that suppress consciousness offer a natural way to perturb the system while leaving much of the organism alive. And that makes them unusually valuable for distinguishing necessary processes from background activity. If microtubules contain a special quantum layer of cognition, anesthesia may eventually reveal it by interfering with that layer in a reproducible and distinctive way. If no such effect can be found, the theory loses one of its most promising biological routes to confirmation. The significance of anesthesia lies precisely in this tension. It brings the speculation close enough to experimental biology that the theory can no longer remain protected by abstraction. From here, the wider landscape comes into view, because Orch OR is not the only attempt to place quantum processes inside the physical machinery of consciousness. Other proposals look to different particles, different molecular structures, and different ways that fragile quantum information might survive within the brain. Orch OR is not the only attempt to place a specifically quantum process inside the biology of consciousness. Once the possibility is admitted that some relevant information might be carried below the level of ordinary neural firing, many different physical candidates become imaginable. The important distinction is that these proposals do not all make the same claim. Some focus on quantum states in proteins. Some consider nuclear spins, which are quantum properties associated with atomic nuclei. Others investigate whether non-classical correlations or quantum-sensitive chemical reactions could influence neural activity. A separate family of models uses mathematical tools borrowed from quantum theory to describe cognition without claiming that the brain itself is performing quantum computation. These approaches are often grouped together in casual discussion, but scientifically, they are very different. A theory that applies quantum probability to human decision-making is not automatically a theory of quantum consciousness, and evidence that a cognitive model fits quantum-style mathematics does not demonstrate that coherent quantum states exist in neurons. The most interesting alternatives to Orch OR therefore begin where Orch OR itself becomes vulnerable, with a specific physical carrier that might survive inside the biological environment long enough to matter. One of the best-known examples was proposed by physicist Matthew Fisher, who turned attention away from microtubules and toward nuclear spins associated with phosphorus. Nuclear spin is a quantum degree of freedom that can, under some conditions, remain isolated from environmental disturbance for much longer than more exposed electronic states. This makes it attractive in a warm biological setting. The brain does not need every molecule to remain coherent. It would need only some physical variable whose interaction with the surroundings is weak enough to preserve quantum information over a useful period. Fisher suggested that phosphorus might provide such a variable because phosphorus is abundant in biological chemistry, and because the nuclear spin of its common stable isotope has relatively simple quantum properties. The proposal was not that phosphorus atoms simply become conscious. It was that certain phosphorus-containing molecules might protect nuclear spin states, transport them through biochemical pathways, and eventually allow those states to influence neuronal activity. An especially important structure in this idea is the Posner molecule, a proposed cluster containing calcium and phosphate. In Fisher's framework, chemical reactions could create pairs of phosphorus nuclei whose spin states become correlated, and incorporation into these molecular clusters might help shield those correlations from rapid decoherence. If the clusters later participated in reactions that released calcium or altered chemical signaling, the quantum state could, in principle, influence when neurons became more or less likely to fire. The appeal of this model lies in the way it separates the fragile quantum variable from the noisy electrical behavior of the neuron. Instead of asking a large protein lattice to maintain an extended coherent state, it asks whether nuclear spins can retain correlations while ordinary chemistry carries them through the cell. Nuclear spins are often less sensitive to electrical noise than charge-based quantum states, so the decoherence problem takes a different form. That does not mean it disappears. The proposed molecules must actually form under biologically relevant conditions. Their lifetimes, reactions, transport, and interactions must match the mechanism. Spin correlations must survive the required chemistry, most importantly. Those correlations must alter neural function in a way that can be distinguished from the ordinary chemical behavior of phosphate and calcium. Each step is experimentally vulnerable. That is a strength if the goal is science, because a model becomes more meaningful when its intermediate claims can fail. It is also a reminder that physical plausibility at one step cannot substitute for evidence across the whole chain. A long-lived nuclear spin is not yet a cognitive process. A spin-dependent chemical reaction is not yet awareness. A change in neuronal firing is not yet an explanation of subjective experience. The same gap that confronts Orch OR returns in another form. Even if a quantum process influences the brain, a theory must still explain why that process is connected to consciousness, rather than simply being one more microscopic contribution to cellular behavior. Other proposals have explored related territory by focusing on spin states, molecular dynamics, electromagnetic interactions, or possible non-classical effects in neural tissue. Some researchers have asked whether electron or nuclear spins could participate in information processing, because spin variables can be unusually resistant to certain forms of environmental disruption. Others have investigated whether biological structures might support collective quantum modes or unusually coherent excitations. These ideas differ greatly in detail and evidential status, and none can be treated as established merely because the underlying physics is real. Nuclear spin is real. Quantum coherence is real. Molecular vibration is real. The scientific question is always whether the brain uses a particular version of these phenomena in a functionally special way. This is the same discipline that prevents quantum biology from becoming evidence for every quantum theory of mind. A robin may use spin-sensitive chemistry in magnetoreception without the human cortex using the same mechanism to generate awareness. A photosynthetic complex may exploit short-lived quantum dynamics without a neuron preserving coherent states across cognitive timescales. Mechanisms do not transfer automatically from one biological function to another. The wider field also contains an important conceptual divide between quantum mechanisms and quantum-inspired descriptions. Human judgments sometimes violate the expectations of simple classical probability models. Order effects, contextual choices, and certain patterns of decision-making can sometimes be represented using mathematical structures that resemble those used in quantum theory. Such models can be useful, but they do not require microscopic quantum states in the brain. Mathematics can be shared across different physical systems. A wave equation can describe water without water being a quantum computer in the same way. A quantum probability model of cognition may capture the structure of uncertainty or context without implying that neurons contain entangled qubits. This distinction becomes essential whenever the phrase quantum mind is used too broadly. Without it, evidence for one kind of model can be mistaken for evidence for another. Orch OR remains unusual because it makes a particularly deep commitment. It connects consciousness not merely to quantum information, but to a proposed objective collapse mechanism tied to space-time. Fisher's proposal is more conservative in one respect because it works within ordinary quantum mechanics and asks whether long-lived nuclear spin states might influence neural processing through chemistry. Yet it is still speculative as a theory of cognition, and even more speculative as an explanation of consciousness. The difference illustrates how broad the field can become once the classical neuron is no longer treated as the lowest relevant level. One theory may place the crucial event in tubulin, another may place it in phosphorus nucleus spins, another may look for a different protected variable altogether. The resulting diversity can be interpreted in two ways. It may indicate that researchers are exploring a genuine frontier where the correct physical mechanism has not yet been identified. It may also indicate that the evidence is still too weak to select among many imaginative possibilities. A mature science eventually narrows its possibilities through experiments that force competing models apart. Quantum consciousness has not yet reached that stage. Theories can often explain why their chosen mechanism might survive, but far fewer results show that it actually operates in the living brain or that consciousness depends on it. This is why the existence of alternatives does not strengthen Orch OR automatically. Several speculative models do not add up to one confirmed phenomenon. Instead, they reveal the central experimental challenge more clearly. A successful theory must identify a quantum variable, demonstrate its persistence under realistic biological conditions, show how biology controls it, trace its influence into neural dynamics, and produce a change in conscious state that competing classical explanations cannot reproduce. Only then would the quantum level become necessary rather than optional. The comparison also changes the meaning of the original mystery. The question is no longer whether consciousness is quantum in some vague sense, because at the molecular level, every brain process is built from quantum matter. The sharper question is whether consciousness depends on a protected non-classical degree of freedom that remains functionally significant after ordinary chemistry and neural computation are taken into account. Orch OR answers with microtubules and objective reduction. Fisher's approach answers with nuclear spins and phosphorus chemistry. Neither answer has yet crossed the threshold from intriguing mechanism to established explanation. Their differences matter because they make different predictions and rely on different vulnerabilities. If one survives testing while another fails, the field would begin to narrow. If all of them fail, consciousness may remain entirely explainable through higher-level neural dynamics. For now, the landscape remains open, and that openness prepares the most consequential possibility of all what neuroscience and physics would have to reconsider if one of these quantum mechanisms, especially Orch OR, eventually proved essential. If Orch OR were eventually confirmed, the first change would not be that consciousness became mystical. It would be that the physical description of the brain had been shown to require a deeper level than conventional neural computation alone. Neuroscience would still need neurons, synapses, neurotransmitters, membrane potentials, oscillations, and large-scale networks. None of those established features would become false. Their role would be reinterpreted as part of a larger hierarchy in which processes inside neurons contribute something essential that cannot be captured fully by treating each cell as a classical information processing unit. This distinction is important because successful scientific theories rarely erase every useful description beneath or above them. Thermodynamics remains useful even though matter is made of atoms. Classical mechanics remains useful even though quantum mechanics underlies it. In the same way, a confirmed quantum contribution to consciousness would not make ordinary neuroscience obsolete. It would mean that some neural explanations are effective descriptions rather than complete ones. The deepest consequence would concern the level at which conscious experience becomes physically determined. Most current models of cognition operate primarily at the scale of neurons and networks. They ask how signals are integrated, how information is broadcast, how recurrent activity stabilizes perception, how attention alters competition among representations, or how the brain builds models of the world and body. If Orch OR were right, those processes might still organize the contents of consciousness, but the transition from organized neural activity to an actual conscious moment would depend on events occurring inside microtubules. The neuron would no longer be the smallest meaningful computational unit. Its internal architecture would become part of the causal machinery of mind. This would reshape experimental priorities. Instead of studying only firing rates, connectivity, oscillations, and synaptic plasticity, researchers would need tools capable of monitoring molecular states inside living neurons while simultaneously tracking changes in cognition and awareness. Microtubule dynamics would have to be studied not merely as structural biology, but as information processing. Questions about coherence, molecular coupling, and objective reduction would become questions for neuroscience rather than peripheral speculation. The boundary between cell biology and cognitive science would narrow considerably. A second change would occur in the relationship between neuroscience and fundamental physics. At present, most brain research does not need quantum gravity. The electrical and chemical behavior of neurons can be described extremely well without invoking the microscopic structure of space-time. Orch OR makes an extraordinary claim because it would connect conscious experience to a process Penrose places near the unresolved meeting point between quantum theory and gravity. If such a connection were confirmed, one of the most familiar features of ordinary life, the existence of awareness, would depend on physics usually discussed in connection with the early universe, black holes, or the foundations of quantum theory. That would be a profound shift in scale. It would suggest that consciousness is not simply an emergent property of sufficiently complicated classical computation, but is tied to a basic feature of how physical possibilities become definite. The importance of such a result would extend far beyond psychology. A successful demonstration of gravitationally related objective reduction in the brain would also strengthen the case that quantum state reduction is a real physical process rather than only an interpretive feature of measurement. Consciousness research could then become entangled with one of the central unfinished problems in physics: how quantum mechanics and space-time fit together. Yet even under this scenario, several popular conclusions would not follow. A quantum mechanism in the brain would not demonstrate telepathy. It would not show that thoughts can alter distant events without a physical interaction. It would not establish manifestation as a mechanism through which intention reshapes external reality. It would not mean that consciousness controls quantum measurements simply by observing them. Those claims would require separate evidence and separate mechanisms. The fact that a process is quantum does not grant it unlimited causal reach. Quantum systems obey strict physical laws, and non-classical correlations do not provide a general method for transmitting arbitrary information outside ordinary causal constraints. A verified Orch OR mechanism would therefore make consciousness more physically unusual, but not supernatural. This separation would become especially important because quantum language is often used loosely outside science. Terms such as observer, entanglement, uncertainty, and collapse can acquire meanings very different from their technical use in physics. If Orch OR were supported, the temptation to treat every unexplained mental phenomenon as evidence of quantum effects would increase. Scientific discipline would require the opposite response. A confirmed mechanism would need to be defined even more narrowly. Which states are involved, how long they persist, what structures protect them, what causes their reduction, and how those events influence neural activity would all have to be measured rather than inferred from metaphor. The theory would become stronger by becoming less vague. Another consequence would concern artificial intelligence and machine consciousness, although the implications would remain uncertain. If conscious experience depends on a biological quantum process involving microtubules and objective reduction, then reproducing outward behavior through classical computation might not be sufficient to reproduce consciousness itself. A machine could, in principle, solve problems, use language, learn, plan, and imitate many cognitive abilities while lacking the physical process Orch OR identifies with experience. This would support distinction between functional intelligence and phenomenal consciousness. Yet even here the conclusion would not be simple. If the essential process is physical rather than uniquely biological, an artificial system might eventually reproduce it using a different substrate. The theory would therefore not prove that machines can never be conscious. It would change the engineering question from whether enough computation is sufficient to whether the relevant physical dynamics can be instantiated outside the brain. Such a shift would force philosophy of mind, computer science, and physics into closer contact. The status of free will would also become more complicated rather than automatically resolved. Penrose's interest in non-computability is sometimes taken to imply that a non-algorithmic brain would escape mechanical causation. But unpredictability is not the same as agency, and quantum indeterminacy is not the same as freedom. If objective reduction introduced genuinely non-computable outcomes into cognition, those outcomes would still need to be organized in a way that supports reasons, goals, memory, and stable decision-making. Randomness alone cannot supply responsibility or intention. A confirmed Orch OR mechanism might therefore challenge a simple picture of the brain as a deterministic classical machine, but it would not by itself settle philosophical debates about choice. The largest scientific change would be methodological. Consciousness research would gain a new set of decisive experiments. Researchers would need to identify the quantum states directly, measure their coherence under physiological conditions, establish their relationship to moments of awareness, and determine whether disrupting them changes consciousness without merely damaging ordinary cellular function. Objective reduction would need independent physical support. The timing of the proposed events would need to correspond to neural dynamics. The same framework would have to explain why consciousness changes during sleep, anesthesia, brain injury, and altered states. A successful theory would not be allowed to explain only one striking observation. It would have to integrate with the enormous body of evidence already accumulated by neuroscience. In that sense, confirmation would make the theory more constrained, not less. The most unsettling implication would therefore be one of incompleteness. The familiar picture of the brain as an electrical network might remain accurate while proving insufficient at the exact point where subjective experience enters the description. Consciousness would sit at an intersection between cellular organization and a deeper physical process, with neither level alone providing the full account. That possibility would not dissolve the hard problem immediately. Even if every microtubule state and every reduction event were mapped perfectly, another question could remain: why should those events feel like anything from the inside Orch OR attempts to place that bridge in fundamental physics? But confirmation of the mechanism would not automatically explain why physical reduction carries experience unless the theory also established that connection. A discovery at the quantum level could therefore transform the map without finishing the journey. What would change most is the location of the mystery. Instead of asking only how networks of neurons create consciousness, science would have to ask how neural organization reaches downward into quantum processes, how those processes return upward into brain dynamics, and why the combined system possesses an inner life at all. That would be a far deeper revision than simply adding another mechanism to neuroscience, but it would still be science in the ordinary demanding sense, a claim bounded by evidence, vulnerable to experiment, and unable to support conclusions beyond what the measurements actually show. Scientific caution around Orch OR does not come from a refusal to consider unusual ideas. It comes from the number of independent claims that must all be true before the theory can explain consciousness. A speculative theory can be interesting long before it is convincing, but the path from possibility to acceptance becomes much harder when each stage depends on another unconfirmed stage beneath it. Orch OR requires biologically relevant quantum states inside microtubules. Those states must persist under realistic conditions in living neurons. They must be organized by cellular activity rather than occurring as irrelevant molecular noise. Their evolution must survive environmental decoherence long enough for objective reduction to matter. Objective reduction itself must be a real physical process. The resulting event must influence neural function. Finally, that event must be connected specifically to conscious experience rather than to some ordinary biochemical transition. None of these steps is impossible simply because it is difficult, but neither can one successful result substitute for all the others. This layered burden of proof is one reason most researchers remain cautious. Conventional neuroscience begins from a different position because many of its mechanisms are already tied directly to observation. Changes in the thalamus, cortex, brainstem, and large-scale connectivity can alter whether consciousness is present. Particular lesions can remove components of perception while leaving others intact. Electrical stimulation can change experience. Sleep, seizures, anesthesia, and brain injury produce measurable changes in neural dynamics that track changes in awareness. These findings do not provide a universally accepted explanation of subjective experience, but they establish that ordinary neural mechanisms possess substantial explanatory power. A new theory, therefore, does not enter an empty field. It enters a field where many observable features of consciousness can already be related to classical electrophysiology, chemistry, and network behavior. That creates a high standard for necessity. A quantum mechanism cannot gain support merely by being compatible with known data. It must eventually explain something that competing classical models cannot explain equally well. This is the difference between being possible and being required. Many physical processes are present in the brain without playing a special role in consciousness. Atomic nuclei obey quantum mechanics. Electrons occupy quantum states. Chemical bonds arise from quantum rules. If a proposed process is simply another microscopic contribution whose large-scale consequences are already captured by classical descriptions, then it adds depth to the physics without adding explanatory power to the theory of mind. Orch OR therefore needs evidence that specifically quantum organization changes conscious processing in a distinctive way. One major unresolved issue is whether the required coherence exists at all under physiological conditions. Evidence of collective motion, electrical activity, or unusual resonance in microtubules would not automatically establish quantum coherence. Classical systems can oscillate. Proteins can support vibrations. Molecular lattices can display complex dynamics without preserving a quantum superposition relevant to information processing. The required experiment has to identify a non-classical signature and distinguish it from ordinary molecular behavior. It also has to do so in conditions close enough to living neurons that the result remains biologically meaningful. A quantum effect detected in an isolated preparation at unusual temperature, concentration, or electromagnetic conditions might reveal interesting physics while saying little about consciousness. The closer the experiment moves toward the real cellular environment, the more difficult control becomes, but the more relevant the result. Another unresolved issue concerns objective reduction. Penrose's proposal is not an established component of standard quantum theory. It is a hypothesis about how and why superpositions end. Experimental tests of increasingly massive quantum systems are valuable because they can constrain collapse models and search for deviations from ordinary quantum predictions. Yet no decisive body of evidence has established that gravitationally driven reduction occurs in the form required by Orch OR. This matters because the theory does not merely need quantum states in microtubules, it needs a particular ending to those states. If environmental decoherence or ordinary quantum interactions fully account for their behavior, then the Penrose mechanism may contribute nothing to the biology. Even evidence for some form of objective collapse would still leave further questions about its timing, scale, and relevance to neuronal processes. The theory also faces a problem of explanatory connection. Suppose a future experiment demonstrated long-lived quantum coherence in microtubules. Suppose another experiment supported a form of objective collapse. Those discoveries would be extraordinary, but they would still not demonstrate that collapse creates conscious experience. A correlation between a physical event and awareness would need to be established. More importantly, the event would need to explain why consciousness has the properties it does. Experiences contain structure. A visual scene has color, position, boundaries, and objects. Memory has temporal organization and emotional associations. The sense of self depends on multiple forms of information distributed across the brain. A theory of conscious moments must show how microscopic events acquire this highly organized content. The term orchestration is intended to address that issue by linking quantum states to surrounding neural activity, but the mechanism remains incompletely demonstrated. Naming the bridge does not yet construct it. This is where classical neuroscience retains an advantage. Large-scale models naturally operate at the level where perception, memory, attention, and decision-making are already represented. Networks can encode relationships among many signals at once. Their activity can be compared directly with behavior and reports. A microtubule theory has to connect upward across several levels before it reaches the same observable phenomena. That does not make it wrong, but it makes experimental confirmation harder. Another source of caution is the risk of explanatory flexibility. A theory becomes difficult to test when almost any outcome can be absorbed into it after the fact. Strong scientific models need predictions that could clearly fail. If coherence should last within a certain range, experiments should be able to measure whether it does. If anesthetics disrupt consciousness through a microtubule quantum process, the theory should predict a specific change that differs from conventional receptor-based explanations. If objective reductions occur on functionally important timescales, their signatures should be identifiable. If the relevant quantum states are prevented while ordinary cellular function is preserved, consciousness should change in a way the theory anticipates. Predictions of this kind are valuable because they force a model to compete with alternatives. Without them, a theory can remain interesting indefinitely while never approaching confirmation. Caution also extends to the philosophical claims surrounding the theory. The hard problem of consciousness does not guarantee that the missing explanation lies in fundamental physics. A gap in current understanding can indicate an undiscovered mechanism, but it can also reflect incomplete concepts, insufficient measurement, or a mistaken way of dividing the problem. History contains many examples where phenomena once treated as requiring entirely new principles were later explained through deeper understanding of existing ones. It also contains examples where new physics really was necessary. The present mystery does not reveal in advance which pattern consciousness will follow. Penrose's argument about non-computability faces similar uncertainty. Gödel's incompleteness theorems are profound mathematical results, but the claim that they establish a non-algorithmic component of human thought remains disputed. If that motivational step fails, Orch OR could still be investigated as a biological hypothesis, but one of its strongest reasons for seeking non-computable physics would weaken. Scientific caution therefore surrounds not one disputed fact, but the architecture of the argument itself. At the same time, caution should not be confused with dismissal. Microtubules deserve study because they are essential and complex biological structures. Quantum effects in living systems deserve study because biology already demonstrates that molecular organization can sometimes preserve them long enough to matter. Objective collapse models deserve experimental tests because the foundations of quantum mechanics remain an active area of physics. Anesthesia deserves continued investigation because it provides one of the clearest reversible transitions between conscious and unconscious states. None of these research directions depends on Orch OR being correct. That is exactly why they are useful. If independent experiments converge on the mechanisms the theory requires, confidence can grow. If they repeatedly fail, the theory can narrow or disappear. The most important missing element is therefore not imagination but discrimination. A decisive experiment must separate Orch OR from explanations that use ordinary neural dynamics alone. Until such evidence exists, the theory remains in a scientifically uncomfortable middle ground, detailed enough to be tested, ambitious enough to matter, but unsupported by the level of direct evidence required for acceptance. The caution surrounding it is not a verdict that consciousness cannot involve quantum physics. It is a recognition that every physical theory of mind must eventually cross the same boundary. From an intriguing story about what might happen inside the brain to a reproducible demonstration that the proposed process is there, that it matters, and that consciousness changes because of it. The most defensible answer to the question of whether consciousness is quantum is also the least dramatic. No experiment has yet shown that conscious experience depends on a uniquely quantum process in the brain. Quantum mechanics is unquestionably present at the foundation of neural matter, because the chemistry of proteins, ions, membranes, neurotransmitters, and every other biological component ultimately rests on quantum rules. But that fact alone does not establish a special role for quantum coherence, entanglement, objective collapse, nuclear spin, or any other non-classical mechanism in the production of awareness. The unresolved issue is not whether the brain is made from quantum matter. It is whether some specifically quantum feature remains functionally important at the scales where conscious processing occurs, and whether removing that feature would alter consciousness in a way that ordinary neuroscience could not explain. Orch OR gives one of the most developed answers to that question. It places the relevant activity inside microtubules, proposes that quantum states there are biologically orchestrated, and links their termination through objective reduction to moments of conscious experience. The theory is ambitious because it attempts to connect three unfinished areas at once: the hard problem of consciousness, the foundations of quantum measurement, and the relationship between quantum mechanics and gravity. That ambition is part of its appeal. It is also the source of its vulnerability. Each connection must be demonstrated rather than assumed. Microtubules must host the required quantum states. Those states must survive realistic biological conditions. Objective reduction must occur as a real physical process. Neural activity must organize the states in a reproducible way. collapse events must influence cognition, and the transition from physical reduction to subjective experience must become more than a philosophical proposal. At present, that chain remains incomplete. This does not make Orch OR meaningless. It makes it a hypothesis whose most important questions are still empirical. The strongest future evidence would not be another analogy between the strangeness of consciousness and the strangeness of quantum mechanics. It would be a measurement. A reproducible quantum signature inside living neuronal microtubules would change the discussion immediately, especially if the signal persisted for biologically relevant periods and varied with conscious state. Even that would only establish the presence of a quantum phenomenon. The next step would be causation. If researchers could selectively disrupt the quantum state while preserving ordinary microtubule structure, intracellular transport, membrane function, and synaptic communication, then observe a specific alteration in awareness. The result would be much harder to dismiss as a side effect of general cellular disturbance. The inverse experiment would be equally powerful. If the relevant state could be preserved under conditions that normally suppress consciousness, and awareness remained present despite the ordinary anesthetic action, the prediction would strongly favor a special microtubule mechanism. These experiments are technically difficult because biological systems do not provide clean separation between levels. Microtubules participate in essential classical functions, and any intervention may alter several processes at once. Yet difficulty does not make the test impossible in principle. It only clarifies what convincing evidence would require. Objective reduction can also be tested outside the brain. Experiments that create superpositions in increasingly massive systems can search for unexplained loss of coherence beyond ordinary environmental effects. If gravitationally related collapse occurs, it should eventually produce behavior that differs from models in which quantum evolution remains unmodified. A confirmed objective collapse mechanism would not prove Orch OR, but it would strengthen one of its most unusual physical foundations. A decisive failure across the relevant parameter range would weaken it. This separation of tests is important, because consciousness should not be used to rescue uncertain physics, and uncertain physics should not be used to fill gaps in consciousness research. Each component has to stand independently before the combined theory becomes compelling. Anesthesia remains another promising boundary, because it creates a reversible loss of awareness while leaving much of cellular life intact. If anesthetic action is shown to alter a genuinely quantum property of tubulin or microtubules at clinically relevant concentrations, and if that alteration tracks consciousness more closely than conventional receptor and network effects, the evidence would become more specific. At present, the loss of consciousness under anesthesia can be described through changes in synaptic transmission, connectivity, oscillatory dynamics, and large-scale integration without invoking a microtubule quantum process. That does not rule such a process out. It means the quantum account has not yet become necessary. The same standard applies to every alternative model. Nuclear spin proposals must demonstrate that the relevant spin states persist, travel through biochemical pathways, influence neural function, and contribute specifically to consciousness. Other quantum brain models must identify the physical variable they depend on and show that it survives biological noise. A field becomes stronger not when it accumulates more speculative mechanisms, but when experiments force most of them to fail. Consciousness research has not yet reached a point where quantum models have been narrowed to one surviving explanation. Instead, the situation remains open on both sides. Classical neuroscience has explained a great deal about the conditions associated with awareness, but it has not produced universal agreement about why subjective experience exists. Quantum theories offer mechanisms that are physically unusual, but none has yet established the missing bridge. The gap between these positions is where much of the fascination survives. It is possible that the harder problem will eventually be reframed rather than solved by discovering a new physical process, a more complete theory of neural representation, recurrent processing, information integration, predictive modeling, or some framework not yet developed may show that consciousness does not require a fundamental departure from conventional brain science. It is also possible that subcellular physics contributes in a way current models neglect. Science cannot decide between these possibilities by preference. The answer has to come from predictions that divide them. The most useful future experiments will therefore be those that place classical and quantum accounts under the same conditions and ask which one makes the more precise prediction. If a conscious state can change while every proposed quantum signature remains unchanged, quantum theories lose ground. If a quantum variable changes systematically before neural and behavioral transitions, survives controls, and proves necessary for awareness, classical sufficiency becomes harder to defend. The importance of this distinction extends beyond Orch OR. Consciousness is one of the rare scientific subjects where explanations can easily become insulated by philosophical language. A theory may sound deep because it invokes emergence, information, computation, space-time, or quantum collapse, while still failing to specify what observation would count against it. The way forward is to reduce the protection surrounding every explanation. A theory of mind has to become vulnerable enough that nature can reject it. That requirement may seem severe, but it is what separates mystery from science. Penrose and Hameroff deserve attention, partly because Orch OR is specific enough to expose itself to that pressure. The proposal names a structure, invokes a physical process, connects it to timing, and offers experimental directions. Its scientific value does not depend on eventual confirmation. A theory can contribute by being tested carefully and found incomplete. If experiments show that microtubules do not sustain the required states, that result would narrow the search. If objective reduction fails, another route closes. If quantum effects are detected but prove irrelevant to awareness, the distinction between quantum biology and quantum consciousness becomes sharper. If, on the other hand, several independent lines of evidence begin converging on a protected non-classical process that tracks conscious state and cannot be reduced to known chemistry, the center of the debate would shift rapidly. The extraordinary claim would no longer rest on the mystery of experience. It would rest on an observed mechanism. Until that threshold is crossed, the unsettling possibility remains suspended between two facts. The first is that the brain is already a quantum object in the broad physical sense. The second is that no special quantum role in consciousness has yet been demonstrated. Between them lies the entire question. Or occupies that space with a proposal bold enough to connect subjective experience to the deeper structure of physics, but still fragile enough that one missing link could break the chain. The physical origin of consciousness therefore remains unresolved, not because science has found evidence that mind escapes matter, but because matter has not yet been shown to explain why experience exists in the form it does. Whether the missing explanation lies in neural organization, molecular dynamics, quantum processes, or a framework that has not yet been conceived remains open. For now, the most important conclusion is not that consciousness is quantum, or that it is not. It is that the distinction has become precise enough to test, and that any future answer will have to survive the same demand that governs every durable scientific idea. The mechanism must be present, the prediction must be distinctive, and the evidence must leave fewer alternatives than it found. The question remains open in a quieter form than the title first suggests. Consciousness has not been shown to depend on quantum collapse. Protected coherence, microtubule computation, or any other specifically quantum mechanism. What has been shown is that the brain is a physical system of extraordinary depth, organized across many scales at once, from molecules and membranes to neurons, networks, and whole patterns of activity. Quantum mechanics belongs to that physical foundation, but whether it contributes something uniquely necessary to subjective experience is still uncertain. Orch OR gives that uncertainty a concrete shape. It proposes structures, mechanisms, and experimental consequences rather than leaving consciousness suspended as a purely philosophical mystery. That makes it testable, but also vulnerable. The theory must survive measurements of coherence, studies of microtubule dynamics, experiments on anesthesia, and independent tests of objective reduction itself. Other quantum proposals face the same demand. They must show not only that unusual quantum states can exist in biology, but that consciousness changes because of them. Until that happens, classical neuroscience remains the stronger explanatory framework for most observed features of awareness, even though it has not yet closed the deeper gap between physical processing and subjective experience. That gap may eventually shrink through better theories of neural organization. It may reveal an overlooked molecular process, it may connect to deeper physics, or it may require a conceptual framework that has not yet been developed. For now, the uncertainty can remain exactly where science leaves it, neither dismissed nor promoted beyond the evidence. Consciousness is still present, still measurable indirectly through behavior and brain activity, and still difficult to place completely inside any physical description. The mystery has not disappeared, it has simply become more precise, more constrained and more patient,